This will be part one of my coverage of Chapter 17, Sexual Coercion. In your text, the title of the chapter obviously is Sexual Coercion. While there are lots of things that I really like about this textbook, there are some things that I don't like as much. This chapter in particular has a little bit of a scattershot approach, just in my opinion. What I've decided to do with my lecture time is to dig down into some specific topics that I think will extend beyond what the text is giving you, and that you might find more practically useful. I've done this with others of our chapters as well during the semester, so I hope you will appreciate it. Before we launch in, be aware, April is Sexual Violence Awareness Month. You'll notice here that I've expanded the title of our chapter to Sexual Coercion and Violence because I prefer some more specific definitions to those concepts. So let's explore that a little bit further. So sexual violence versus sexual coercion, there's some confusion as to how these two terms are used. Both are used very broadly without a tremendous amount of consensus as to how specifically they should be used. When I talk about sexual violence, I've used the definition that is used by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They define sexual violence as a sexual act committed or attempted by one person or multiple people without freely given consent by the victim. It can also include behaviors committed against someone who's unable to consent or to refuse, such as someone who is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Violence of a sexual nature can happen when a person forces or coerces a victim to engage in sexual acts with another person. It can also involve a person who hasn't freely given consent, and also situations where the person is unable to form consent, either because of their age or their current physical or emotional situation. Sexual coercion, and this is the term used by your textbook authors, involves unwanted sexual activities that happen under a very specific set of circumstances. So when you're being pressured, tricked, threatened, or forced in a non-physical way. Now, I've adopted, this definition comes from the Department of Health and Human Services Office on Women's Health webpage, because that was one of the few places that I found a specific set of information concerning this concept of sexual coercion. So I think it's helpful to make a distinction between what we mean when we say sexual violence, which in some ways, in many of the organizational sites that I've looked to in creating this presentation, they use this term as an umbrella, and under that umbrella are lots of different concepts, including sexually coercive behaviors. So digging a little deeper into sexual violence, on the CDC website, the CDC, in drawing some conclusions about what we should know as just people who are members of this culture, what should we know about sexual violence in the United States? Well, the first is that sexual violence is very common. Estimates range, but it is estimated by the CDC based on data that they collect routinely that 1 in 3 women and approximately 1 in 4 men will experience sexual violence that is physical in nature at some point in their lifetimes. That should be a very astounding statistic to you if you weren't familiar with it before. They also estimate that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 38 men have experienced either a completed or attempted rape. They also include this statistic, which you may find hard to understand until you sit down and really think it through. 1 in 14 men report that they were forced to penetrate someone, either completed or attempted. And when you think about that, you have to remember that penetration it has a legal definition. You have terminology used by the CDC, by the FBI, and other sort of criminal justice reporting agencies that can include being forced to engage in oral sex or other forms of sexual interaction that include penetration. The other kind of summary point that the CDC makes is that sexual violence tends to start early and is experienced disproportionately by the young. 1 in 3 women who have reported, either officially reported or unofficially reported, experiencing rape, 1 in 3 report that that occurred for the first time between the ages of 11 and 17. Of those, 1 in 8 reported that it occurred before age 10. For males, 1 in 4 male rape victims reported their experience of the event was between the ages of 11 and 17, and about 1 in 4 of those said it occurred before age 10. The final kind of take-home summary item is that sexual violence costs people, not just in terms of their emotional lives, their physical health and safety, it also costs them economically. One estimate, and I don't know how actuaries make these kinds of conclusions, but one estimate is that if you are a victim of rape, that the expense to you per victim is going to be about $122,000. So think about, your student loans, your car loans. If you imagine, ask the homeowners in your life what their mortgage is. It's a huge expense, and what that means is that when you are a victim of rape, you may lose opportunities that other people who were not victims of rape would have had economically. So think about it in terms of you could have gone to college, but you have medical expenses, you have lost job opportunities, lost productivity, having to take time off to go to court, and other kinds of tangible costs. Now, sexual violence comes in a lot of different forms, and I'm just going to, this is a scattershot list that comes from the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. Sexual harassment is a term that I'm sure you've become overwhelmingly familiar with in recent years with the Me Too movement. Child sexual abuse, intimate partner sexual violence, incest, drug and alcohol facilitated sexual assaults, stalking, using technology, abuse by medical professionals, and certainly if you're in Ohio, you've heard a great deal about those kinds of cases because we've had several very high-profile cases coming out of Ohio State. Sexual exploitation by helping professionals, such as therapists, people who are assaulted by multiple perpetrators, such as in gang rapes. Elder abuse can sometimes take a sexual form, and sexual abuse of people with disabilities is often a really hidden form of sexual violence. People with cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, are at particular risk of being sexually abused. We also have to think about the vulnerability of people in our country who are incarcerated. Rape and other forms of sexual assault is a particular risk when you are incarcerated. And we also have to think about other institutions, such as the military, where sexual trauma occurs fairly frequently. Now, I just mentioned RAIN. A lot of what I will be presenting in this presentation, in part 1 and in part 2, comes from the Rape, Abuse, Incest, and Incest National Network. I use a lot of their resources when I talk about these issues with college students because it's a fairly comprehensive site. RAIN has a very large network and infrastructure and does good work. They run a national sexual assault hotline, and they work in partnership with lots of local organizations that provide sexual assault services in their local areas. They also work with the Department of Defense in its initiatives to reduce sexual assault and to provide services to people who have been assaulted. RAIN also has, and if you are interested in these issues, if you're interested in advocacy in this area, RAIN has a wide variety of programs that you can look into. Now, RAIN reports, and they are kind of curating data from lots of national and international sources. I'm focusing only on the national question of sexual assault and sexual violence within the U.S. context. RAIN reports that young women, so children, adolescents, and young adults, young women are particularly at risk. We know that already that girls and women report higher sexual violence rates than men and boys. In some ways, though, you need to keep in the back of your head, maybe in the front, the fact that boys and men systematically underreport. Even if we take that into account, girls and women are still disproportionately more likely to be exposed to sexual violence. When we look specifically at juvenile victims, so children and adolescents, 82% of those victims are reported to be female. When we look at adult victims of rape, and you do keep in mind for this bullet point, we're talking about people who have had contact with the criminal justice system. So 82% of juvenile victims are female, 90% of adult rape victims are female. RAIN also reports that girls between 16 and 19 are more likely, significantly more likely than people in the general population to report rape, attempted rape, or other forms of sexual assault. Women between 18 and 24 who are college students, so that should prick up your ears, are 3 times more likely than women generally to be exposed to sexual violence. And finally, females who are traditional college age, so that 18 to 24 group, are four times more likely than people in the general population to experience sexual violence. Now, just because girls and women are disproportionately affected, we should not forget that men and boys are also exposed to sexual violence on a regular basis. As reported by RAIN and other sources, about 3% of men, about 1 in 33, report having had the experience of attempted or completed rape. Now, I mentioned before, boys and men systematically underreport. There are social and cultural reasons why boys and men are even more resistant to report sexual violence than girls and women. Some of it has to do with the idea of masculinity and assumptions that are made about men who are sexually victimized. Regardless, you look at the 3% number, that's a lot of people. Now, if we imagine that that's underreported, you can kind of inflate that number a bit in order to get a better picture of what the actual numbers are. About 1 out of every 10 rape victims that reports, and again, this is criminal justice data, is reported to be male. Now, if we think specifically about college students who are male, so we're looking at college students in that traditional age grouping of 18 to 24, you have a 5 times increase in risk. and we'll come back to some of the reasons why college students are at particular risk. But just you have a dense population and institutional setting where individuals may be, using alcohol and drugs at a higher rate, and the possibility of interacting with someone who will sexually victimize you goes up. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, some other groups so far we've talked about males and females in general. We do need to pay some specific attention to specific groups who are at heightened risk for sexual violence. In the LGBTQ community, and this is data that was reported by the Human Rights Campaign, and they were pulling data from the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is a survey that is done every few years and reported out to do surveillance and reporting of this issue. What they found, and this is a lot of numbers, but try to keep your eye on the ball. About 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women have reported experiencing rape, physical violence, or stalking. So they're including here in these statistics the sexual violence aspect as well as domestic violence of a physical form or stalking, because those are all components that are interrelated. And this is behavior coming from an intimate partner. For heterosexual women, the reported rate is about 35%. So you can see an increased rate for lesbians, and with that 61%, it's much higher for bisexual women. 26% of gay men, 37% of bisexual men report the same things, and that's in comparison to straight men. So you see a little bit of a micro theme here. You have, for gay men, their rate is roughly equivalent, although a tiny bit lower than for heterosexual men, but the rate is higher for bisexual men. 46% of bisexual women have reported being raped. So that 61% reported earlier, that includes rape, physical violence, and stalking. The 46% here is just the group who reports having been raped. So for heterosexual women, about 17% report that, 13% of lesbian women. 22% of bisexual women report having been raped by an intimate partner, and that's compared to 9% of heterosexual women reporting the same thing. Finally, 40% of gay men, 47% of bisexual men have reported experiencing sexual violence other than rape. And that's a long list of possible kinds of specific sexual violence. And that's in comparison to 21% of heterosexual men. Among transgender and bisexual people in particular, because those are two groups of people within the LGBT world that are at particular risk. Transgender and bisexual people do tend to report, in some studies, far higher rates of sexual violence being perpetrated on them. And when you drill down into the data, that violence often begins in childhood. The U.S. Transgender Survey, and this is being reported by the Human Rights Campaign, in 2015 found that about 47% of transgender people report having been sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. The term sexually assaulted is a broad term, so you can include forms of sexual violence under that heading. Now, if you add in the intersection of transgender status and race and ethnicity, we find that for people of color who are also transgender, the rates go up much higher than what we find in other populations. So if you're transgender and white, the rates are a little lower, than if you are transgender and, say, Native American, if you're multiracial, Black, and so on. They also report that nearly half of bisexual women who have survived rape, they tend to report that that occurred early. So their first experience was between 11 and 17. Another population that we tend not to discuss very often is what happens to people in the correctional facilities that are all over our country. The United States incarcerates a far higher percentage of its population than other industrialized countries. So we're talking about a very large number of people who are currently incarcerated. Incarceration comes with a whole host of negative potential outcomes. One of those is vulnerability to sexual violence. When you look at the actual reporting of sexual victimizations in adult facilities, those rates have been going up steadily in recent years. And those are figures that are based on only things that are actually reported. So you need to think about if we have this as a statistic for reported sexual victimization, you have to actually kind of multiply that in order to get a picture of what's really happening. So for example, correctional administrators report just under 25,000 allegations of victimization in prisons, jails, and other facilities in 2015. Experts estimate that is a very low figure in comparison to what's probably actually occurring in correctional institutions, particularly in prisons where you have high density, overcrowding, and limited supervision. People who are in jails and prisons and other facilities who identify as LGBTQ are disproportionately at risk of being sexually abused, being sexually victimized as a member of an incarcerated facility. For people who are trans, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and facility to facility. For many people who are trans, they will likely be incarcerated with people not of their identified gender, but they will likely be housed with people that are consistent with their physical gender. So for a trans woman, for example, she would likely be incarcerated with males as opposed to being incarcerated with females. That increases the risk of sexual victimization in that context. For incarcerated youth, so people under the age of 18, you have similar kind of disproportionate risk groups. Kids who are LGBTQ are at far higher risk of being victimized in youth facilities, as are gang members, which is an interesting statistic. The military has its own special issues in terms of sexual violence. Women are still disproportionately underrepresented in our military, but they are more integrated into military service activities than ever before. Since our involvement in the Middle East, since 9/11 in particular, we've seen more and more and more women and LGBTQ people who are active participants in military engagements, including combat operations. And we also have more access to information about the military than we ever have in the past. And what that has shown us is that there's a long-standing history of problems with sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and so on in the military. Now, the data that we have access to largely comes from the military itself, but then there are estimates that are made in terms of what's the actual level of sexual violence that's being experienced by people in the military. Some have estimated, looking specifically at sexual assault experiences of women in the military, the estimate is that rate has increased to about 6% in 2016 data. Now, this is research done by the Pentagon, so it's research done on the military by the military itself. The prevalence rate is estimated at around 6% for women. The prevalence rate for men has been pretty stable over time, and it's less than 1%. Now, as with some of the other things I've talked about already, the nature of military culture makes reporting sexual assault, sexual harassment, gender harassment, rape, it makes reporting all of those things to people who are in a position to do something about it less likely. So there are aspects of military culture that make it highly unlikely that people will report. So while we have these estimates, such as this one, where of active duty military, 5% of women and 1% of men indicate that they had experienced one or more sexual assaults in the past year, those are likely to be underestimates by a fair amount. What's difficult is that we don't have a good way of investigating what that actual number might be. In terms of sexual harassment and gender discrimination, about 26% of women, 7% of men have reported those things. And here's, this just signifies why those earlier numbers, like the 6% number and the 0.7% number, are probably low, particularly for women. 52% of women reported that they were retaliated against when they reported an assault. Think about the context of, say, you're assaulted by someone who is actually a superior officer. If you go, because chain of command might suggest that you should be reporting that to your direct superior. Well, if that's the person who assaulted you, you go over them. In the military, that may be perceived as breaking chain of command, at least in the spirit of it. And the retaliation comes from fellow soldiers, from other officers, and so on. So about half of women who reported their assaults were retaliated against. And for many of those, they report that that is a reason they will never report it again, because it interferes with their well-being, it puts them at risk, and it interferes with their careers. Now we're going to finish part one by kind of opening our discussion of college students, because you're college students. So I want you to get an understanding of the particular situation of sexual violence experienced by college students. As reported by RAINN, college-age women, traditional college-age women, 18 to 24, are at particular risk in comparison to the general population of all people. So in comparison to all women, regardless of age, you have college student women, 18 to 24, they're at a 3 times risk in comparison to the full population of all women. Women who are not in college of that same age group are at a 4 times risk. So regardless of whether you're in college or not, just being a young woman, a young adult woman, puts you at greater risk for sexual assault. As reported by RAINN, about 11.2% of all students experience a rape or sexual assault. And that rape or sexual assault occurred through physical violence, physical force, or during incapacitation through alcohol or drugs or other means. If we include graduate and professional students, about 8.8% of females, 2% of males report experiencing rape or sexual assault in that same categorization. Excuse me. Among undergraduates, 23% of females and 5% of males report rape or sexual assault during their time as students. And then finally, you can add to the mix here, about 4% of students report having experienced stalking while they were in college. Now, all of those statistics, for some of you, those will not be surprising statistics. You've lived as college students, whereas I have not, at least not in a really long time. But when I show these statistics to people who are kind of outside of the higher ed environment, they're shocked. They're kind of legitimately taken aback, because the stereotype is that college is this super safe environment where people are insulated, they're carefully monitored. But in fact, being on a college campus has its own specific risk factors that make the possibility of sexual violence even more likely. And that's where we're going to pick up when I start part 2 of this presentation.